Good morning and good afternoon. Thank you all for joining us today for our Untangle 101 webinar on public cloud. My name is Steve Young and I'm with the marketing team here at Untangle. Today we have Brian Carmichael, who's our technical marketing engineer on our product management team, and he's going to run you through our AWS and Microsoft Azure public cloud options. Just a few housekeeping rules before we get started. If you have any audio issues, please use the audio panel to select your preferences and configure your audio options. If you select a phone, you'll need to dial in and use the access code provided. And just a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, so you'll have the option to rewatch or revisit the areas that you're going to follow up on. We will be answering questions throughout the presentation, so please submit any questions through the Q&A box that you see on the GoToWebinar control panel. And we do have staff standing by answering questions. And as always, you can send questions to sales@untangle.com as well. And especially if we don't get to your questions during the webinar, you can always follow up with us at sales@untangle.com. Even though this wasn't put into any of our registration emails, but stick around to the end of our webinar because we are giving away a $50 Amazon gift card at the end of the webinar. One lucky name will be drawn and we'll reach out afterwards to send you the card. And with that, I'm going to turn that over to Brian and take it away.
Thanks, Steve. So today we're talking about the public cloud deployment of NG Firewall. So for the agenda, we'll start off with a brief description of what is public cloud. The NG Firewall public cloud use cases, we'll talk about the two different licensing options, bring your own license versus pay-as-you-go. We'll cover some pricing examples and talk about how to calculate the cost. Then we'll go into a bit more of the technical details on describing the various components, virtual components that you would need in a public cloud environment, as well as a pretty comprehensive walkthrough of a setup in AWS and also in Azure. So just a brief definition here of public cloud. It's leased infrastructure provided by Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and a few others. In the context of NG Firewall, we're mostly going to be talking about Azure and AWS, since those are the two platforms we support. As far as the payment and how that works, it's based on consumption, so it's really just what you use in terms of your virtual resources being processing, storage, and bandwidth, among other things. As far as deploying our instance in Azure AWS, it's done kind of similar to how you would deploy an app on a smartphone. There's a marketplace of approved apps, and you just select the app and away you go. And as I'll show later on in the presentation, I'll walk through the steps for how you can deploy NG Firewall in those in the public cloud. Just to cover some of the benefits of public cloud, no upfront costs, so there's no expense in infrastructure. Again, you're just paying for what you use in virtual resources. With that in mind, it's very easy to deploy. Just again, it's like deploying an app on your phone. The setup is very straightforward, so you don't have to wait for hardware to be shipped or deal with any kind of physical infrastructure. It's all virtual, so you can deploy very quickly, as I'll show later on in the presentation. Also, Microsoft and Amazon provide a SLA, your 5 nines, so you definitely get the high availability aspect. You don't have to worry about your internet service provider going down, which can happen. In the case of public cloud, you can pretty much be assured that your instance is going to be running nonstop, uninterrupted. It's also easy to get static IP addresses. Sometimes with on-prem deployments, that's not always an easy thing. Getting a static IP means you need to upgrade your service or jump through hoops or wait, crazy amounts of time to get a static IP. And once you have one, trying to change it is not terribly easy. So that's one of the bigger benefits, I think, of public cloud, is how easy it is to get a static IP address or change it if you need to. If there's something wrong with that IP address, you want to get a new one. Usually when they reassign you one, it'll be in a completely different subnet. So it's not going to be the next one in a sequence, which might be on some kind of blacklist or something like that. So that's personally one of the benefits I find with public cloud configuration, is how easy it is to get static IP addresses. It's also easy to scale resources. Again, because it's all virtualized, if you want to add another couple of cores, increase RAM, increase storage, bandwidth, any of those types of virtual resources, it's incredibly easy to do just because of the fact that everything is virtual. So now we'll cover a few different use cases for how or why you would deploy NG Firewall in the cloud. And probably the most common and easiest to deploy use case is as a VPN gateway, which you're acting as a central hub using that static IP address. But the main benefit here is that you're creating a virtual network so that you can connect all of your offices with a central VPN hub that is always online and again, easily accessible via its static IP address. And in this particular deployment, it's probably the easiest use case because it only involves one network interface. And in terms of the VPN protocols, you have all the standards that we support, being IPsec, IPv2, GRE, or OpenVPN. A similar type of deployment involving VPN is SD-WAN. And in this case, you're going to be running full tunnel. So mostly you're filtering everything internet bound through your cloud instance. And the benefit there is that you can filter all of the content and manage all of the policies centrally. And it also, one of the benefits is just like with the VPN gateway scenario, is it allows you to interconnect all of your branch offices and mobile users. We also, at this point, I should mention that we do have a beta SD-WAN router product that is available for download if you wanted to take a look at the virtual appliance. And if you have a Command Center account, you can go into the downloads page and get access to that. And as far as this particular deployment, it's the same requirements as the VPN gateway use case. A slightly more advanced scenario is the virtual firewall. So in this case, you might be running actual other instances in the cloud. So you're routing and protecting other virtual servers or virtual desktops. And also you're getting all of the visibility and monitoring all of the traffic that's coming in and out of your virtual network in the private cloud. It also provides secure remote access via VPN. So if you can see in the illustration there, you would be connecting from your branch offices via VPN to access those virtual servers or to remote desktop into those virtual desktops. And all of the internet connectivity is going to be filtered through your cloud gateway, your NG Firewall virtual appliance. One note about this particular scenario, as you'll see a lot of lines being drawn in that diagram, it involves an internal private network, which is adding another network interface and configuring additional routes. So it does add a slight bit of complexity to that scenario, but we do have documentation in our knowledge base that describes the steps for configuring that type of setup. So now we'll cover the difference between bring your own license and pay as you go. So those are the two licensing options in public cloud. So with pay as you go, it's a single price, and that combines both your infrastructure cost as well as the NG Firewall licensing cost, which with pay as you go is a NG Complete Unlimited license. So it's kind of an attractive option from that standpoint, and it's somewhat easier to manage because the billing and the usage is done and managed all entirely by the cloud provider. So the licensing cost is bundled into your infrastructure cost that you're paying on a monthly basis to AWS or to Azure. One side effect of this is that we're not able to offer discounted pricing with the pay-as-you-go. So if you do qualify for discounted pricing, you might want to consider the bring your own license. So just now to cover the BYOL option, this is a separate licensing option. So you're paying separately for the infrastructure and the Untangle license. But one of the benefits of doing it that way is that you can choose which license type you want. So for example, you can do an IPsec for 25 devices, or you can do an annual or multi-year type of license to get an added discount there. And as well, if you do qualify for discounted pricing, you can get that with the bring your own license. You can also transfer a license when you do the BYOL option. So if you are running an on-prem instance and moving your appliance to the cloud, you can transfer your existing license over to your cloud instance. So now we'll cover the cost calculation, which is broken up into two pieces that I was just mentioning previously. So you've got your infrastructure cost and then your licensing cost. So as far as the infrastructure, that's broken down into compute, data transfer, and storage. So the compute is generally going to start at around $30 or $40 a month for sort of an entry-level appliance. And then your data transfer is going to cost roughly around $2 for each 100 gigs. And your storage is going to cost about $10 per 128 gigs. These are general averages between AWS and Azure, but if you'll see there's cost calculators that are linked here on this slide, and you'll find if you sort of spec out various configurations that the pricing is quite comparable between AWS and Azure. So from a price standpoint, whichever option you choose, your monthly cost is going to be roughly the same for the infrastructure. As far as the Untangle licensing, if you choose the BYOL, it's going to start at $25 per month. And if you do the pay-as-you-go, it's going to depend on the size of the instance that you choose. So kind of similar to the way we do unlimited licensing for our hardware appliances, where an unlimited license for a Z4, for example, is going to cost less than for a Z12. And the reason is because it's tied to the size of the appliance. So as you'll find when you do the cost calculations, and in the following examples here, the pay-as-you-go licensing cost is tied to the size of the instance. So now we'll cover a few different examples between Azure and AWS. So for a smaller environment, kind of like your Z4, smallish network up to 50 devices, in Azure, your infrastructure cost for a sort of a basic system, basic instance of 2 cores and 4 gigs of RAM is going to cost you about $38. Then you've got your data transfer fees, which this is going to be somewhat variable. It's going to depend on every environment. But here I'm taking an example of 1 terabyte of transferred data, which would cost you $20 for that month. And then the storage, let's just say you're not doing a whole lot of reporting and you're going with just sort of the basic 32 gigs of SSD storage, that'll run $2 a month. So your total infrastructure cost there is going to be $60 for an entry-level Azure system. And then the licensing part, if you go BYOL, is going to be about 100 devices or $100 for a 50 device license, or $90 for the pay-as-you-go. So you see the bring your own license and pay-as-you-go, the licensing cost is going to be somewhat comparable, although with the pay-as-you-go, you're getting an unlimited license there. So your total monthly cost for a smallish type of instance in the cloud is going to run you about $150, $160 a month, depending on which licensing option you choose for Azure. In AWS, with the same specifications, 2 cores, 4 gigs of RAM, a terabyte of data transfer, and a 32 gig storage, you see the pricing is generally similar. It's going to run you $55 for the infrastructure, so just a few dollars less than Azure, and you see the pay-as-you-go and bring your own licensing cost there. So it's roughly the same, a slight less cost for Amazon, but very comparable either way, ranging around $150 per month. For a larger instance of upwards of 500 devices, in this case, we're looking at an instance of 4 cores with 16 gigs of RAM, so something like our Z12 type of appliance. It's going to run you about $154 for the instance. Then we'll assume about 2 terabytes of data transfer at $40, and then a 256 gig SSD. So this will give you quite a bit more reporting, and that's going to be $20. So your infrastructure cost there is going to run you just over $200 for that type of a virtual appliance. And then your licensing cost, if you do BYOL, it's going to be, for 500 devices, it's going to be $500. In this case, the pay-as-you-go is actually quite a bit more cost effective. So for the pay-as-you-go, it's only going to cost you $223. So for the Azure pay-as-you-go for a larger instance, actually it's a bit more of a cost-effective option to go this route. So you'll see roughly your monthly cost for a larger instance is going to be about $700. Bring your own license, or about $437 for pay-as-you-go. And in AWS, a similar sized instance with 4 cores and 16 gigs of RAM is going to cost you roughly the same price, infrastructure-wise, just under $200. And so your total bring your own license cost would be $689 or $621 with the pay-as-you-go. So now we'll get into more of the technical details of the deployment, starting with the network components. So when you build out or when you deploy NG Firewall in the public cloud, there's a few things you have to do beforehand, which basically is preparing the network. So just like if you were to deploy a physical hardware appliance on your network, you're going to need a switch and all the networking equipment, internet connectivity, an IP address. So there's a lot of physical pieces that you need. So the same is true for public cloud infrastructure. You're going to need virtual components. So in this illustration here, I've pointed out some of the main pieces that you would be building out in your public cloud virtual network. So that's going to include, firstly, your virtual network, which is an IP range, then subnets that are within that virtual network. Then you have route tables that control how to route table within your, how to route traffic within your virtual network. Then you have security groups, which are kind of like mini firewalls within each subnet. And as you'll see in the following steps, obviously because we're deploying a firewall, essentially the security groups are either going to be disabled or sort of set as an open policy. And then you have a public IP address, which typically you would want to reserve as a static IP. Then you have network interfaces that are assigned to your NG Firewall instance and joined to a particular subnet. And then you have your virtual gateway, which is a virtual appliance that grants you internet access, that routes you out to and from the internet, because in a public cloud environment, you actually are behind another NAT device. So you'll get a privately routable IP address, and it's the virtual gateway that's actually managing your static routable IP. So now we'll go into the technical details, and this is actually a series of screenshots just because it's going to be much faster to show the deployment. It'd take quite a bit more time if I were to log into the AWS portal and go through the steps. So I'm kind of taking a shortcut to show a series of screenshots with both AWS and Azure in terms of how you would go about deploying NG Firewall as a VPN gateway in the public cloud. So your first step once you're in the AWS portal is to launch the instance. So you're going to choose, as you see in the screenshot there that's called out, launch instance. Then you're going to search in their marketplace for Untangle, and that's where it'll present to you your two options of bring your own license or pay as you go. So you choose the option that you want to go with. And then your next step in this wizard is to specify the size of the instance. So if you, in this screenshot here, we've gone with the T2 small. When you hover over it, it'll show you the virtual specs. I think this one is, it says there one virtual CPU with 2 gigs of RAM. So that's going to be, I think the cost on that is about $30 a month. So that'd sort of be an entry level instance type. And then you get into the configuration of the instance. So where do you want to put this instance? So you're going to specify your virtual network or your VPC, and then the subnet within that VPC. And then you'll also want to specify what kind of a public IP address to assign. And so for this selection, you'll want to make sure you say enable as far as assigning a static public IP address. In the next step, you're going to choose the volume of storage, and with AWS, they let you specify the storage size as part of the deployment. So in the setup wizard. So here I've selected 30, as you see in the box there, the red box. This is where you would choose, whatever size instance, depending on how many devices and how much reporting data you plan on consuming. So then the next step is adding tags, which this is an optional step, and generally it's not required. I put a tag in there. And then, as I was mentioning earlier with the security group, so this is a step where you want to make sure it's an open policy. So in this call out, I've specified all protocols for all traffic types, the entire port range, and a 000/0 network, which means everything. So we're creating a totally open security group here, simply because we're deploying a firewall. So we really don't need an additional security layer that's really just going to add for complications down the road when you can't access VPN or the web administration or other ports and you're wondering what's going on, and it's because there's some policy in a security group that's blocking those ports. So the recommendation here is to create an open security policy group to avoid any complications down the road. And then the last step, you'll download your SSH access key. You may or may not need SSH access to your instance, but this is a required step for all instance types in AWS. So just make sure you download your key pair and you keep that in a safe place. One of the first things once you've deployed the instance is to give it a name, because in the subsequent steps, you're going to be creating network interfaces and other objects that you're going to need to refer back to or assign to your instance. So in this case, it's important once you've deployed the instance to give it a name. So here I've just called it Untangle NG Firewall to keep it simple. So then the next step is to allocate the static IP. So in all the different use cases I described previously, it's important that you want a static IP address. So here you're going to the elastic IPs. You see that call out in the menu there, allocating a new address. And then your next step is to associate the address. So once you've created it, you then associate it. And you see in the selection, they let you choose a network interface or an instance. So we previously named the instance Untangle NG Firewall. So then we can just search for it and find it. So you see in the right-hand screenshot here, we can see the instance ID and the name that we assigned to it, and then you can associate that static IP address to the instance. Once you've created a static IP and assigned it to the instance, now you can connect to it once it's up and running. So in the general details of the instance, you'll see the instance ID, which you want to take note of that and copy it, because that's actually going to be the default password for logging into your web administration. And then you'll see also the internet routable static IP address, and that's what you're going to plug into your browser to connect to the web administration. And that's it for getting your instance up and running in AWS. So now the next series of steps is going to be showing you the same type of thing, but in the context of Microsoft Azure. So with Azure, there's a few things you need to do just before spinning up an instance, whereas in AWS, pretty much we were able to create the virtual network and all kinds of other related objects in the setup wizard. With Azure, there's a few things you have to do prior to deploying the instance, because you need a container, you need in other words, a resource group, or somewhere to put this instance once you have spun it up. And you'll also need to associate certain things to that instance, because the setup wizard in Azure does not let you define necessarily all of the same types of objects. So the first step in Azure is to make sure you have a resource group, and a resource group is where all of your subscriptions as well are assigned. So as you see in the screenshot here, I've got a pay-as-you-go subscription, and I've created a new resource group within and assigned it to that subscription. I called it my resource group, and then I associated a region to it. So in the next step, we're creating a virtual network. And that's so similar to whereas in AWS, that was done within the instance wizard. Here we have to do this step prior to deploying the instance. So you would go to create a resource, create a virtual network, and here we're giving it a name and an address space. And then in the next step, which is part of this virtual network wizard, we are assigning a name and a subnet, which this will be assigned to the WAN subnet. And there's also a few other options. For the most part, you can just go with the defaults, but want to point out here, again, disabling the firewall, because we're obviously deploying NG Firewall in this virtual network, so we don't need to have yet another security layer that could potentially add complications down the road. So once we've created the virtual network and assigned the subnet, dropped it into a resource group, now we're ready to launch the instance. So your next step is to create a resource, search for Untangle. You'll see the option here in the marketplace. So you'll select the Untangle NG Firewall option there. And then this will bring up your wizard, your instance deployment wizard. So you're going to select the licensing type if you want to go with the bring your own license or the pay-as-you-go. Click create, and this will open the wizard with your options for configuring the instance. So first step, assign the subscription to it and which resource group you want to put this instance into. And then the next part of this basics step here is to give your virtual machine a name and assign it to a region. And if you have any availability options you want to assign, you can specify those. That's an optional step. The image is, again, the Untangle NG Firewall, whether you do the pay-as-you-go or bring your own license. And then you specify the size of the instance. So if that's however many CPUs and RAM you want to go with, and if you want to change the size, you just click change size and configure whichever size instance you want to go with. And then you're configuring, so just similar to in AWS, the last step had you download an SSH key. In this case, for simplicity's sake, you can choose password, and this will make things a little bit easier. So you can put in here a name and a password for secure shell access to your instance if you need to configure it via SSH. And then one of the last steps here is to configure the storage. So you can choose if you want to go with premium SSD or standard SSD or spinning drives. I'd certainly recommend at least standard SSD, if not the premium solid state. And then under the networking, you're going to specify the virtual network to assign to this instance, the subnet, which these were the two items we previously created. So we've got a WAN subnet, and when you set up the virtual network through that wizard that I showed in one of the previous steps, it automatically assigns an internet route to that subnet. So when you assign the subnet to the instance, it's going to give you internet connectivity. And then we're going to assign a public IP. So here you're going to choose the create new under public IP. It's going to open this wizard where you'll choose to assign a name to this public IP address. And for assignment, as you see, I've drawn with the box there, we'll choose static, as in most cases, you'll probably want to give your instance a static internet routable IP address, since it's going to be acting in most cases as a VPN server. And here, getting back to the security groups, you do have an option here to choose none, which is the recommended selection here, just again for keeping things simple and not having multiple security layers that can add to complications. So in the last step, you're just going to review and go ahead and create the instance. So once the instance has been created, your next step is to expand the disk. So one thing that's different between AWS and Azure, AWS uses dynamic disks, so you can choose during the setup wizard what size disk you want. when the instance boots up, it will automatically adjust the file system to inflate to the size that you specified. With Azure, they all start with a fixed disk size, which is only 3 gigabytes. So you're definitely going to want to expand that. So it's basically enough for you to get the instance up and running. But if you plan on doing anything with the instance, you'll want to increase the storage size. So the first step is to go into the properties for your virtual appliance, go into the disks for that appliance, and under the configuration for the disk, you can adjust the size from here. So you want to stop the instance, adjust the size, and then restart the instance. And I should point out that this process, once you increase the storage size, can take several minutes depending on the size that you choose here. So definitely you'll need to be patient once you start the instance after resizing the disk. It could take upwards of even 30 minutes to boot the instance, depending on what size you've selected for the storage. So once you've adjusted the size of the storage, then the next step is to assign a host name to the IP address. And of course, you can use your own DNS and just update the DNS to point to the static IP of your instance. Microsoft also provides a sort of a default generic cloudapp.azure.com domain that if you want, you can create your own host record within that, and they'll host the DNS for you. So in terms of just kind of getting up and running easily and quickly, this is an option for you, just to go into the configuration for your public IP address and to configure a host name for it. So once you've deployed the instance and configured a few basic settings like the host name and the static IP and the storage, then you can connect to your instance. So in the general properties of the instance, you'll see the IP address there, which you'll open in a browser to connect to the web administration, and the default login. So as you see from the login page there, the default login is the name that you assign to your instance. So with AWS, your default login is the instance ID. With Azure, the default login is the name that you assign to your instance. And obviously, once you get into the product, you're going to change that. So if you happen to give it a very simple name, don't worry, you'll be changing that password in the very next step once you get logged in. So once you do log in, this is the standard NG Firewall wizard that many of you are probably familiar with, where you configure your language, the network cards. One kind of unique aspect to the public cloud is that in a lot of cases, in several of the use cases, you only deploy a single network interface because it's acting really just as a VPN gateway, which can still provide routing to the public cloud internet. So you really don't need multiple network interfaces in this case, unless you're protecting and acting as a virtual gateway to protect virtual desktops or virtual servers in that sort of advanced scenario. So here, just click continue anyways and go proceed to the next steps. And then choose if you want the automatic upgrades and connecting to Command Center, which are certainly recommended options to choose. Once you get into the product, you'll want to configure a few items here based on the fact that you have a static IP and a host name assigned. So you're going to put in here the host name. So under the config network, you'll assign the same host name as you see here based on the Azure example. I'm putting in the host name there. And this is important because when you build VPN profiles, that name is included in the VPN profile that you send out to the clients. So you want to make sure that the name that you put here matches what you configured for your instance. Then you'll also want to make sure that you choose use host name as the option here in that same host name configuration setting. The next item you want to configure in NG Firewall is your SSL certificate. And this is going to make sure that when you connect, either whether it's VPN or to the web administration, that you're connecting to the host name that is on that's associated with your instance. So here in the screenshots, we're creating a new certificate authority as well as generating a server certificate. So you want to specify both of those items. And then the last step is to install your apps. So if you are going the SD-WAN route or the virtual gateway, you'll probably want to install most of the apps. If you're running it just as a VPN gateway, you may only want to install IPsec or OpenVPN or Tunnel VPN apps. And as far as the configuration of IPsec or OpenVPN, obviously this is just sort of general, but making sure that in the VPN config for IPsec, you've enabled L2TP, XAuth, and IKV2 server, and for OpenVPN, that you've enabled the server and then started to configure the profiles for your remote clients. So that's it for the walkthrough of deploying NG Firewall in public cloud. Here's a couple of resources. I believe we'll either make the presentation or at least the recording available afterwards. So don't worry about scrambling to write down these links. They'll be available to you afterwards. And that concludes the presentation for deploying NG Firewall in public cloud. Looks like there was a few questions that came through and they've all been answered, it looks like. So I'm not sure, Steve, if there's...
Yeah, I think we'll go through the names for the webinar Amazon gift card, I believe. And let me just pull up the list. Drum roll. And the winner is Robin Mohan. Thank you, Robin, for attending the webinar. I will be sending you the information to redeem the Amazon gift card afterwards. You're welcome. And for the webinar, it will be available on our YouTube channels, and I believe GoToWebinar sends out a recording link, so that will be sent over shortly. And I want to thank everybody for attending today's webinar, and I hope that it was very informative. And thank you, Brian, for presenting. And that's the end of our webinar. Thank you.